I'm Robertson Green. Welcome to A Conversation with Ken Burns. It's been said that more Americans get their history from Ken Burns than any other source. In 1981, Burns created his first film for PBS, the Academy Award-nominated Brooklyn Bridge. Ever since, his films have consistently given viewers a unique look at the story of America. Events that shaped us as a nation. During the 1990 premiere of Burns' landmark series, The Civil War, 40 million people gathered in front of their televisions to learn and be touched by events that occurred 130 years earlier, as if they were hearing the story for the very first time. In a significant way, they were. Stories of Americans from the North and South were given fresh voice, and our shared history came alive. The Civil War proved to be the highest-rated series in the history of public television, and today is considered to be one of the most influential documentaries of all time. For his work, Burns has been honored with 12 Emmy Awards, 2 Oscar nominations, and when he was only 55, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. Burns' films include The War, Baseball, Jazz, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, Prohibition, and coming soon, a story we here in the Panhandle consider to be our own, the Dust Bowl. Burns and his production team are touring our area this week, providing a sneak peek of the 2-part series to many of the very people who lived through the Dust Bowl. And today, Burns is in our studio to talk with us. Please help me welcome Ken Burns. It is not hard to draw a crowd when you tell them Ken Burns is going to be in the room. It's because I think you changed the way we relate to our history. I mean, you've taken it out of the dusty book and made it come to life.
Well, that's very kind. You know, I think I was trained by still photographers who reminded me that there's much more drama in what is or what was than anything that the human imagination dreams up. I had originally wanted to be a feature filmmaker in Hollywood, and I think that if you see the still photograph or the single image as the DNA of what we've tried to do, then our job is always to try to wake that past alive, to take that old photograph and see it as a representation not just of that frozen moment, but of something that represents something that had a past and a future. And if you can wake that photograph up by energetically exploring it, by adding sounds and first-person voices in addition to the third-person narrator, then maybe, just maybe at times you feel like you could touch history and that it doesn't become some dry subject, but something we all care about, which is essentially story.
You also have an effect named after you, the Ken Burns effect.
Yeah.
It's that slow pan we've all seen.
Well, you know, part of making the old photograph come alive was to treat it. You know, I wanted to be a feature filmmaker, so if I now look at a still photograph, I treat it the way a feature filmmaker would a master shot. It has in it a long, a medium, a close. It has a tilt, a pan, a reveal where you zoom out. You can isolate details. So that's only one part of what we try to do to sort of wake up the past, to apply the defibrillators and say, you know, here it is. But it got, you know, sort of reduced by Apple, who wanted to have people have the opportunity to take their downloaded photographs and pan and zoom and make little presentations for their families of weddings and other things. And so they named it after that.
But you also, it is true, and you've talked about this, you have natural sound underneath of what might be happening. I don't think most people get that they're hearing that.
You know, we engage, and the we is really important to understand. There are lots of really talented people who work on films that end up with my name on it, which is wholly unfair to them and to the honesty of the production. They're writers and co-producers and associate producers and editors, and they do that. But essentially we work, if I were to reduce the hundreds and hundreds of techniques we engage, we have sort of 4 visual and 4 oral on the soundtrack. We have interviews, we have live cinematography, we have newsreels, and we have the still photographs I was talking about. On the soundtrack, we have the traditional third-person narrator, usually. We have first-person voices. reading diaries and journals and love letters. We have period music or other music that's evocative of that time, sometimes played on period instruments. And we have a complex sound effects track. It isn't just one thing of soldiers tramping. We might at any moment have 30 or 40 different separate tracks, which we hope to blend into a melange of sound that makes you think that maybe that photograph is moving, that if you move in a certain way, if you have this sound effect, that somebody's talking, that you have that sense that maybe history is not was, as William Faulkner said, but is.
So you might have someone talking about someone coming through the back door, and you see a back door, but you hear the creak of the...
That's right. You hear the slam of the door. You know, in our Dust Bowl film, we're dealing with intensely personal, sometimes excruciatingly tragic family stories, and we're left with a handful of archives. Sometimes we don't even have the particular archives from the family and have to sort of go to generic photographs. But one of the ways we can move the story along is, just as you suggest, by sound effects. Somebody's got a hardware store business in Follett, Texas, and you see an exterior of a hardware store, and suddenly you hear the little jingle of a bell, and the doors, strain out and then slam shut, and then it just gives you the sense, very subtly, that you might be there, you might be participating in this drama.
They say that history is written by the victor, but as when you're trying to document history, how do you get to the truth? How do you cut through all that hype?
Well, it's not always written by the victors. The South lost the Civil War, and for the next almost 100 years wrote the history of what the Civil War was about. The popular version of the Civil War was not just lily white, but really changed in its conception. So that's not always true. But I think your larger question is, how do you actually tell a history that benefits from a variety of perspectives? That it is not just the official version, the top-down version, that it's not just American history is not just a sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by wars, but it's about a whole bunch of other things. Women, minorities, labor, so-called ordinary people whose Dust Bowl stories tell you they are far from ordinary. All of this is what goes into, I think, good history. And good history is told all the time in many different shapes and forms, and we've just tried to say one narrow view just isn't enough. How do we triangulate that moment? How do we fix it more honestly and accurately by showing a variety of perspectives? So it's not just one person's story, one person's view, but a variety of views. And it always makes for a better kind of history.
Don't you think when we look at historical characters that we have a tendency to make them anything but multidimensional, when in fact, everybody is?
That's exactly right, and that's a hugely good point and question. Let's start off with somebody that is one of my heroes, Abraham Lincoln. He's a god now. He's always perfect. And we struggle with this, not just in filmmaking, but in the academic academy. When you involve in this sort of hero worship, they give it a fancy name called hagiography. And you have to be careful of that, because quite often, the sum of Lincoln's-ness is here, but he's always represented here. He's always greater than who he was. And for a while I was disturbed by that. Even in my own work there was a sense, I realized that the difference between how people are actually and how we represent them is our wish for ourselves. Now that's a good thing. The other thing, and that's important because history, why do we study history? The past is gone, we're never going to get it back. But history is also the set of questions we in the present ask of the past. So it's informed, however subconsciously, by our fears and our anxieties, and most importantly, our hopes for now and our future and our posterity. That's a really good thing. So the fact that we might invest our stories, our historical stories, with some sense of them being about what we want most in life, that's terrific. At the same time, we have an obligation to tell the truth. We have to have an obligation to say that people are multidimensional, as you say, that they do have flaws, that Lincoln was tardy on slavery, that Lincoln was depressive. Today he might be under medication, which would render him, of course, in our media culture, incapable of running for president. Franklin Roosevelt confined to a wheelchair, the subject of a series we're working on right now. There's no way a crippled person could possibly help the country, particularly in its darkest hours. The greatest crisis since the Civil War he handled in the Depression and World War II. So we try to look at history from lots of different perspectives and people from different perspectives, and also acknowledge in the way we tell the story that how things are now are not quite, you know, as good as it was before. We can take lessons from that history. We can draw on their leadership examples.